Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not how you were expecting. I'm Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker. And Megan, what are we talking about today, the week after the election?
So, I don't know that we want to belabor too many points here, but the thing that we are going to talk about today is rejecting issue polling and embracing persuasive politics.
Now, that title might not mean anything to you if you are not into politics, if you're not a poll watcher, aficionado, so to speak. But essentially what this is all about is that the 2024 election surprised a lot of people. And it surprised a lot of people in particular because there was a lot of issue polling, what we call issue polling, and we'll get into exactly what this is in a moment. But it showed that people, large majorities of them, supported the things that Harris was running on.
Support broadly Democratic policies.
Yeah, and during the election itself, lots of Democratic policy priorities managed to pass through the ballot initiative process. Other Democratic candidates ran far ahead of Harris on the ticket. And so what we're going to try to do today is explain how that happened, how that's possible.
What is going on.
Right? What's going on. Talk about the explanations for this election. Talk about the laser focus that the Democrats and leftists and progressives specifically seem to have on this type of issue polling and why we think it's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And then talk about what is persuasive politics as we conceptualize it, and how do we practically get away from this focus on issue polling and embrace this sort of more persuasive garden variety door-to-door politics. So Megan, why don't we start with the top of what happened last week, and what are some of the explanations that are going around for it?
Yes. Well, so we are recording this the week after Donald Trump was elected to be the now 47th president of the United States, in addition to the 45th president of the United States. While all of that happened, we did see some interesting state-by-state results, though, and those seem to be really sticking in people's minds as something that needs to be explained. We saw in states like Missouri, where Trump won the state's electoral votes for president. A Republican, Josh Hawley, won the statewide Senate race, but additionally, in Missouri,
on the same ballot, mind you, right?
Same
like
ballot,
making it clear to everyone. Yeah. Same voters.
Missouri voters also decided to add protections for abortion into, I believe, their constitution, and that was an initiative that went through all kinds of various shenanigans and tomfoolery between the state Supreme Court, the state Secretary of State, and the voters to get it on the ballot in the first place.
Yeah, it was a marathon even just to get on the ballot.
Yes. And then additionally, they also voted in favor of several different types of worker protections. I think paid family leave.
There was a $15 minimum wage proposition as well.
Yeah, those sorts of things. Ordinarily, honestly, you would expect to see those in a state that doesn't have the initiative system. That's something that the state legislature ordinarily would deal with. In many states with initiative systems, that's something the state legislature would be dealing with. So you have that happening in Missouri. Then over in Arizona, former client of mine, Ruben Gallego, Democrat, wins the Senate race in that state. Additionally, they also voted to protect abortion rights in Arizona. However, Donald Trump won.
Gave their electoral votes to Donald Trump fairly convincingly. Like yes. the most Republican of the sort of 7 battleground states that people were watching. Mm-hmm, and this pattern repeats itself across the country, right?
Yes.
Democratic candidates outrunning Harris down ballot, progressive policy being passed or almost passed in a lot of
Mhm.
places.
Mhm.
Florida comes to mind as an area where they would have passed marijuana legalization and an abortion rights
And
amendment,
abortion rights,
if
but they
not
have
for
a
the
super
crazy
majority.
60% threshold
Yeah.
that they have for a proposition actually passing.
Mhm.
Which I should note, the proposition that made it so that Floridians have to pass propositions by 60% passed with less than 60% of the vote. So,
Go team.
yeah, go team. But so the basic idea here, the basic thing that we're trying to get across here is that progressive policy in lots of places seemed much more popular than
Mhm.
progressive candidates.
Mhm.
Moderate candidates as well also outran their progressive or extreme Republican counterparts most places
So we
in
have
down ballot races.
we have a situation then in sort of the post-election analysis where everyone's priors were correct.
Yes, everyone's priors were correct.
That is right.
Donald Trump didn't win the election by very much. Progressive policy did well, but moderate candidates beat out extremist candidates.
And people, when exit polling keeps showing that people think Harris is way more liberal than she was.
Yeah, so everybody's priors got confirmed here. But personally, and I haven't talked with Megan about this, I say this as though we agree on this.
Yes.
My read of the situation here, and I think the most dangerous takeaway that people could take away, the worst wrong lesson that people could take away from this is that, well, people already agree with us. This was just a fluke, right? And so we don't need to change anything. Now, for my part, I think that largely this election result is a story about inflation and people's sort of backlash to inflation. But even with that being the case, the fact remains that it seems pretty clear that Democrats have invented a way to lose elections while people agree with them. And this goes ditto and even more so, I think, for the more progressive wing of the party. And you'll see lots of people on the internet and in real life in the coming days, weeks, and months talking about how, well, if Harris had just run on these progressive policies, then she would have been victorious. And we do not think that that is correct. Because even though these progressive policies won, Democrats who supported them lost. Yeah. And that is the rub. That is the thing that needs to get explained.
That's what we have to figure out here. As Democrats, as people who support progressive policies, what's happening there, and how do we get more people to vote for the people who will implement these policies when they are elected to legislative or executive office?
Yeah. And so I think in starting to answer that question, one of the key important things here is understanding that issue polling in and of itself is not sort of a be-all end-all here. Issue polling in and of itself does not demonstrate clearly that the American public supports something and that they want it to happen. We work with a lot of surveys and polling data and various things in our work as PhD students. Megan, do you want to take a little bit of why these issue polls are maybe not to be trusted at face value, perhaps?
Sure. I think over broad strokes, I can take us into it a little bit, and then I will certainly defer to you as the person I think does more survey research. But broadly speaking, a poll may not be the best way to get to understand what people care about. There are a number of different biases that emerge when you are conducting or when you are participating as a respondent in a poll. You, as a human being who likes to exist in society so as to avoid getting eaten by lions on the savannah, you want to have the approval of the person you're talking to. Most of us have a desire to win the approval of our interlocutor, whatever situation we are in. And so this is especially an issue when it comes to getting people to admit to their racism, for lack of a better term. It's very hard to probe racial resentment in a survey because most people know that they aren't supposed to say things that would lead you to conclude that they have race-based biases that they are acting on or operating on. But that's the same thing when it comes to issue polling. Maybe you don't want to say out loud, I really want my Latino neighbor to be deported, if that's what you believe.
Yeah,
because
or you don't want to say that you want social spending to be cut, because it's it's an untoward thing to believe in sort of polite conversation.
Part of you knows that this is a controversial opinion that might get you met with some disapproval, and so you don't want to say it. So there's and this is going back to the 2016 election, something that we were discussing in terms of polls undercounting Trump support. People had an idea that they didn't want to admit to supporting him, and that was one of the reasons there was such a big polling miss before the 2016 election.
And so what Megan is talking about here is called social desirability bias. But social desirability bias is only one type. It's only one of the problems that can arise with this kind of issue polling. There are, quite frankly, a dozen or more of these problems that you can imagine rearing their ugly head in any given issue poll. One of these is the issue of framing. Framing is basically the way that you present a question, the way you present a policy to people. If you ask people how they feel about social spending, you'll get much higher approval than if you ask about welfare, for example. If you ask about Medicare for all and don't mention the fact that people's taxes might have to go up in order to pay for it, you get 60, 70% approval. And that approval craters the instant that you tell people your taxes might go up. Like, if you ask people, do you support Medicare for all? 65, 70% will say yes. If you ask them, would you support increasing taxes to fund a national health insurance plan? Support is like 30 or 40%, right? So that's another problem, is framing. Another one of these issues is preference intensity, right? Polling cannot tell you how much people care about things. People even can't really tell you how much they care about things. Like, if we ask people to rank oftentimes how important issues are to them, they only really know about the first 5 issues that they put in that rank order. If you get much longer than that, everything beyond that is basically just their best guess, right? And then third and finally, there's this idea in the political science literature about people's opinions in public opinion polls not being real, so to speak. The idea being that you're someone hanging out, you get a call from a pollster, or you get an email telling you that there's a survey for you to take. The pollster or this survey asks you about something that you really haven't considered whatsoever, right? Not at all, since most people are not plugged into politics in the way that Megan and I are, or the way that people who listen to this podcast might be, right? And you get asked a question about Medicare for all, about tax policy, about deportations, about housing, about whatever, right? And you give an opinion, right? You say, oh yeah, I guess that sounds good. And then you promptly go back to not thinking about it anymore, right? And so this is associated with few scholars, principally with John Zoller, who's professor emeritus at UCLA, where Megan and I are students. And the long story short is that even if people are telling you things, even if it represents some sort of real quote-unquote opinion, it's still just their opinion in that moment, and you don't know how much it's going to impact their future vote down the line, whether it's going to be a motivator for them to turn out an issue upon which they actually
absolutely. And I think we have all of these issues with polling in the first place, but kind of dovetailing off of that concept of issue intensity, we also have a situation where votes are an incredibly imprecise measure of anybody's sentiment on any particular issue. So when you are voting for a candidate for Congress, you are voting on opinions about abortion, healthcare, social spending, infrastructure, foreign policy, all of these things at the same time. And under many circumstances, you may be in a situation where you have candidates who disagree with you. One candidate disagrees with you on one issue, another candidate disagrees with you on a completely different issue, and you have to pick what is most important to you in that moment. Just as an aside, I think it's possible, Clayton, that I socialize with more Republicans than you do.
Almost entirely the case. It would be hard for someone to It would be hard for someone to socialize with fewer Republicans than I socialize with. Not gonna lie.
So, in light of that fact, I have been speaking with Republicans over the past week or so. And I brought up the issue of abortion with somebody that I know does not personally support a total ban with no exceptions on abortion. And he said to me, you know, not one single Republican that I know supports that. I'm like, okay, but you voted for a politician who does. But you did that because you line up with that politician on other things. You know, what is that about? How did we get there? And so you have voters who are trying to decide their own issue intensity, and it's almost like, I mean, this is the point. It's like a conjoint experiment come to life, where you're forcing that choice, or people could abstain or not turn out. You are forcing people to prioritize issues to the extent that they know the policy preference of the politicians they are voting for. So that's another possibility, that maybe this is kind of a below the fold issue that people didn't necessarily care about a ton, or a candidate decides not to publicize because that candidate knows that they don't line up with the public on that particular issue. So it's entirely possible that the public is not informed about a politician's policy preference on a particular issue, so they don't know they're out of alignment.
Something like 40% of people in these public opinion surveys cannot even name their representative to the House of Representatives. Like, that is the level of political knowledge that we are dealing with. If you are listening to this podcast, you are probably in like the top 20 to 10 to 20% of all political engagement in the United States, right? And so I know that this feels weird to you if you're listening to this. It feels weird to us, right? That people don't.
Let's take a quick detour then and talk about how other people are making these choices. We are talking about, when we're talking about finding the politician who agrees with you and voting for them, we are talking about, perspective issue-based voting. But many political scientists will say that voters aren't making choices on the basis of what the policies are going to be of each candidate in the future, because that takes so much information. What people are doing may be a fairly low information assessment of either their own personal economic circumstances 4 years ago versus today. This is Mo Fiorina all day long. Or identity-based political affiliation, where they are getting cues from their family or their larger social group about what people like them should support.
Yeah.
And then I think feeds right into party ID, and you are just voting for the D or the R, and it's not any more complicated than that.
And I think another important thing to note here is that even if, say, 80% of voters were well-informed, voting on policy, choosing the candidate that is closest to them on policy grounds, making these types of trade-offs that Megan and I have been talking about, if the remaining 20% of voters are doing retrospective voting, or identity-based political affiliation, or some combination of the two, those 20% of voters are the ones that are going to swing the election.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
You don't need everyone to be doing prospective vote. You don't need everyone to be doing retrospective voting. You don't need everyone to be doing these social identity-based voting schemes, voting like little what's the word I'm looking for here?
I don't know, man.
Damn. All right. Well, it'll come to me.
We don't need everybody to be doing prospective policy-based voting.
Yeah, we don't need everyone to be doing these two things that we've been talking about. We don't need them to be doing retrospective voting, or there we go, heuristics. That's the word I was looking for. Damn. Almost had
I don't know how I didn't come up with that, man. Like,
so we don't need everyone to be using these lower information heuristics. We just need enough people to be using these low information, basic, look out your front door, see how things are going, or what groups do you belong to heuristics in order to make the difference in elections. And so when Democrats just assume that they're going to win by campaigning on the issues that most people agree with, or when progressives, both within and without the Democratic Party, don't do the work of actively campaigning and actively trying to convince people that they are right because they look at this issue polling and think, everybody already agrees with me, there's no convincing that I need to do here. That is a recipe for electoral failure, because the people you need to reach, the people you need to persuade, are not, one, even maybe answering those issue polls, or two, if they are answering those polls, their responses do not mean the same thing as the voters who are tuned into policy, who are voting based on this sort of spatial economic voting model of I'm going to vote for the person who most aligns with me on my most important policy issues.
Yeah.
That is what we think the problem is here in terms of campaigning and persuasion on the left.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to talk to you about more after the break. Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When Megan and I left you, we were talking about all of the problems, basically, with issue-based polling and how this has worked historically. And what we want to talk about now is the back half of the episode title. So we've talked about why we should reject issue polling, why this is a problem. Now we want to talk about actually embracing persuasive politics. But persuasive politics is not like a well-defined term with a dictionary definition and everything.
This is not a term of art.
Yeah,
this
not
is
a term of art. Not something that you are expected to know what it means. So first and foremost, we're going to go over sort of a couple of ways of thinking about what persuasive politics is, because it doesn't just have to mean one thing or one strategy. For me, the most important dimension of persuasive politics is this need to be continually convincing people that progressive views are actually correct. Because there is like a trap here where, like, we know we're right? Like, as progressives, we have a very strong belief in the policies that we believe in, and that those are the right things to do. And so there's this trap that we get into of when we see the information in these issue polls that confirms our biases, we like to see this information that everybody agrees with us. We then go straight on and say, all right, cool, don't need to do any convincing. Not my problem. Unfortunately, though, it is our problem.
Remains our problem.
It remains our problem because no, everyone doesn't actually agree with us. And it's really, really important that we're always making it clear what the positions are, what they would do, and why they are important. And that leads into the second thing, which is Megan's more important dimension of
I wouldn't
politics.
say it's more important. Always be convincing is very important. But my other dimension of persuasive politics is to raise the issue salience of things that people agree with progressives on. And part of this is focusing on the information environment and meeting people where they are. An example I would give you of this would be conversations about public funding for childcare. During the Biden administration, there was a push to include publicly funded childcare as infrastructure in some ways. And pun fully intended, that does seem to have been a bridge too far for some people. But if you go to a business owner and say, what if I told you the best candidate for this job is a woman with a small child? She can't afford childcare, so she can't re-enter the workforce. And you can't afford to pay her enough to pay for her childcare. Wouldn't it be great if there was some way to lower that cost for her so you could hire the best person for this job? That business owner is probably going to say, yeah, actually, I would prefer to have a wider talent pool to draw from when I'm hiring. That raises the importance of publicly funded childcare to that voter. It's just really meeting them on the basis of what they already think is important.
Yeah, and on top of this, and I know we're sort of like yada-yadaing a little bit over the like controlling the information environment. That's a big thing.
I have heard that podcasters are very important.
Yeah, we're very, very important. But no, so I think this is the other part of meeting people where they are, right? Is like you have to bring political information to people in places where they are getting other types of information. I know we've said it several times over the course of this episode, but it really does bear repeating. Most people are not plugged into politics, right? And so if you're only delivering this information to people on Pod Save America or on 60 Minutes, on in outlets like the New York Times and the Atlantic and all that, you're missing large numbers of those politically salient voters, the ones who right now are deciding based on retrospective voting, backwards looking, am I better off than I was 4 years ago? And these identity-based political connections. You're missing all of them, right? And this is where I think sort of like I don't know if you've heard about this, Megan, the idea that's been floated in the last week of, well, liberals need their own Joe Rogan.
Oh, yeah.
I think this is where like this misses the point, right? Because there isn't a conservative Joe Rogan, so to speak.
Joe Rogan.
The show is not organized around politics, right? Nor are many of these other shows that like nonetheless have a political influence, right? But they're not based around politics. People aren't going to those shows because they're going to get political information, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about changing the information environment, we mean basically taking what Pete Buttigieg does and like going on any and anything that people want him to and dialing that up to 11, right?
Yeah.
Like Democrats need to be meeting people where they are, and that is everywhere, right? Like this is what we mean by controlling the information environment a little bit more.
Absolutely. Because I think one of the most consequential changes in American politics more generally, but specifically related to the information environment, is the atomization of information sources. When everybody had the evening news on, because it came on right before the sports program or whatever, you all got a little bit of political information. Same thing with the newspaper. Yeah, you're looking for the box scores, but you are flipping past the front few pages with political news in them. You don't have to do that anymore. If you just want to listen to a sports podcast, in many cases, you can listen to it without getting the politics. However, this is when I have been listening to this conversation about we need Joe Rogan, and the response that I heard, oh, that's a good point. New Heights is a more liberally coded sports, not politics podcast that does throw in a certain worldview or perspective on things that are kind of political. They're probably not talking about tariffs, but they're talking about mutual respect and responsibility for your fellow man. And I think that's kind of useful and does have a certain political valence to it.
And to be clear, more liberal people should go on Rogan. They should do it. Like he'll have them on, right? Even if it's more confrontational, more oppositional than it would be going on a Pod Save America or, any of these other sort of left-wing podcast empire stuff.
What's the point of only talking to people who agree with you?
You can't just talk to people who already agree with you. Again,
like preaching to the choir is an idiom for a reason.
It is, it's not persuasive politics. We're once again talking to people who already agree with us, right? And so this is a problem, right? And I think this is going to be a longer term process, right? So both of these things, I think, are sort of the first step here. And like Megan and I, we want to be clear here that like we're not trying to give you like a series of Google Maps directions for how the Democratic Party and how progressives like win future elections, right? Like this isn't a step-by-step series of directions you can follow. It's not a recipe. This is like an atlas, basically. This is like how to think about this.
Here is an option, yes.
Yeah, how to contextualize this for yourself.
Also, I strongly believe that the results of this election are not monocausal, and any attempt to identify the one simple trick that will lead to lasting progressive change is a fool's errand. This is one way to do this, and this is something that we think is important.
Yeah, and I'll add to that lots of people have this, I think, idea in their heads of a eventual liberal victory that will endure for a generation, right? They have this idea that at some point, the trouble will be over, right? Everyone will agree with us, and we'll never have to worry about the Republicans being crazy ever again.
If we have learned anything from history, it is that there is always a backlash to progressive change.
Yeah, and
every single time.
And this idea that at some point we're finally going to be able to like lay down the lay down the podcast microphones and stop talking about these things and trying to convince people and fighting the fight of politics, it's just totally wrong. I had a professor at undergrad who used to tell us that the struggle is the point, right? And I think that this really informs how I go through politics. Like, the struggle is the point. There's always going to be another problem. There's always going to be another fight to fight. In the mid-20th century, it was the civil rights movement, right? Basic rights for African Americans in the United States. We still haven't achieved that goal, right? But we won some of the most important fights there, right? We won voting rights for African Americans in the United States. We dismantled legal Jim Crow at the very least, right? And yeah, there are still problems that we have to face. And lots of people are going to look at this, they're going to think that that's disheartening, right? And that, well, what's even the point, right? If we continue to have to deal with this day in and day out, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. But I honestly find this motivating, right? This idea that there will always be another fight to fight, and so you don't have to worry that this is the last one, and this is the one that will make or break the century of progressive dominance, right? That's not how this works. There will always be another fight to fight, and we just have to keep going.
That's a really great perspective, and the only thing that I would add to that is, yeah, be sure to hydrate. Get a Cliff Bar. No, we just. There is never going to be a time when we don't have to stand in the breach. And we are, you and I, two people who I think are privileged to be able to do it. And we bring to that fight some privileges on the basis of, I'm going to go ahead and say, our apparent racial identity. We bring a certain amount of security, where maybe some of our friends and neighbors wouldn't have that security. We are better off than most people in terms probably of our projected financial position, if not our current one, and our education. And we should be doing as much as we can with that. And that's our job. That's our role in this life, is to make sure that we are continuing to stand up and show up for the causes that we care about. So with that, I think we need to move on to another point, which is, yeah, it is our job.
Yeah, it is our job, right?
It is our job.
I like, obviously, as Megan just said, right? There is a very real extent here to which we are not the best vessels for this particular message.
This next little
this next particular message, and this is like to progressives specifically, not to Democrats in general, but to progressives specifically. I am sorry, everyone. But it is our jobs to educate. It is our job to educate people. It just is. Like, I know, again, Megan and I are not great vessels for this. But when you shut down discussion with anyone and everyone by saying, it is not my job to educate you, that does not help in terms of persuasive politics. It doesn't convince anyone that what they did was wrong or problematic. It doesn't teach anyone about the proper way to handle things. And quite frankly, it probably backfires, like, to be perfectly honest, right? When people are shut down, they don't typically react particularly well. And so the problem that I think we have here, and again, really being very clear that we are not exactly the best vessels for this. But then again, a lot of people who are like perfectly in a societal position where you can do the educating, right? And Megan and I, I'm sure, are both guilty of this ourselves when we're annoyed or tired or don't want to engage, have done the same thing and pulled, it's not my job to educate you.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Like, if I don't have to, I'm not going to tell you why that's sexist. You have to go figure that out for yourself. That sort of thing. That doesn't help. It doesn't. I think probably one of my most useful contributions to that discourse was teaching my young male colleagues about what yes, all women meant, in the sense of like, gosh, why is this woman not talking to me? I'm just being polite and she's shutting me down. I'm like, you don't know, she just got harassed on the subway on the way over here. He's like, oh, yeah, yes, all women. But that little interaction is all that it necessarily took to kind of make that click in a way that made sense, that a hashtag didn't. And so when we have the opportunity to educate, even if we're not sure in somebody's sincerity, whether they're, I'm just asking questions, or if they're really just asking a question, take them at their word, and just assume good faith and be as helpful as you can in that situation would be my take on it. Yeah, I'm sure there are days when I'm just like, I'm so freaking tired of this, I don't want to do it. And if that's you on any given day, I would say to disengage politely.
Yeah, I mean, we're none of us are going to uphold this at all times.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
But I think that the broad takeaway of this point here is that if you don't educate them, no one's going to. At least in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. And this goes into sort of the broader point about the information environment. Let's say that it's something to do with like racism or something to do with immigration or what have you, right? Really like sort of lightning rod things, right? Mm-hmm. And someone is saying things that you sort of know to be incorrect, are wrong, are in many instances, at least like racially inflected, if not outright racist, right? Mm-hmm. And then you tell them, it's not my job to educate you.
Google it.
And then they're going to Google it. And then the first result that's going to come up is, hi, I'm Dennis Prager. And today we're talking about how slavery was good for the United States. Like, that's the alternative world. When you tell people it's not my job to educate you, you're sending them to Ben Shapiro. You're sending them to Dennis Prager. You are sending them directly to your ideological opposition, and they're going to explain it in a way that sounds nice, that meets these people where they are,
makes them feel good,
and confirms their existing biases, right? Like, you're taking a hard thing to convince people that they are in fact wrong about something, and you're making it even harder by allowing them to go further down a rabbit hole of confirming their own pre-existing biases. There's a lot of research on how this happens on the internet. Like, people fall into these rabbit holes all the time. And even if it's not most people, again, if it's a non-trivial percentage of them, then that's still a problem, right? Yes. And that is, I think, the takeaway of this. It is, in fact, our job to educate people. Like,
it's our job, and it's our opportunity. We have the opportunity to talk to people about what we care about and to convince them that we're right and make sure that they treat it with the same level of priority that we do.
Yeah.
You know,
Like,
you've convinced me. You've convinced me that this is a privilege, Clayton.
You don't want to seed the information war right from the off, basically. Like that's the basic point of this part of persuasive politics, is that people are getting information from somewhere. If they are interested in a thing, they're going to try to find information about it. And if you are not going to educate them about it, odds are they're going to find that information somewhere else, and it's going to be information that you wouldn't have given them and that you would rather they not have been given in the first place.
Yep.
That's it. That's sort of that's the takeaway from this point. And then fourth and finally, there's one last thing that I think underlies all of this sort of persuasive politics. And Megan and I maybe have not been doing a great job of this last point over the course of the last 40 minutes or so. But that's that you got to talk about things in a way that people can understand them. You got to you got to dispense with the jargon. You got to get rid of all of the SAT words, like heuristics, exactly, right? Like you got to get rid of that kind of language when you're talking to certain people, because it's just going to turn them off, right? There's nothing.
Some of that, can I jump in there on that point? Because that's so valuable. Again, you know, I am friends with Republicans. I worked in a fairly conservative environment. Nothing shut a conversation down faster than the word privilege. And there are just some words that are just lightning rods and derail your conversation. And that's just, is it a valuable word and a good point to make? Yes. Is it worth having then a conversation about whether or not white privilege exists?
Yeah. And it's like, it's as simple as like the way that you talk about these things, the terms that you use. Like there's an interesting working paper, for example, on whether or not using the term Latinx makes Latino voters less likely to vote for a given candidate. And they find that these effects are pretty large, right? Yeah. Like Latino voters do not like the term Latinx. And well, so, okay, sure.
I didn't take Spanish, but isn't the gender inclusive word for Latinos?
In Romance languages, the gender inclusive form.
French.
Yeah. In all of the Romance languages, I'm pretty sure they obey the same grammatical rules here.
Yes.
The gender inclusive way of talking is the masculine. Yeah. And sure, we can talk about whether or not that's in a certain academic circles or whatever. You can absolutely there's a time and a place for these terms, right? But does using the term Latinx instead of the term Latino actually mean anything to our support of different marginalized groups if we end up voting for the same sorts of protections? I don't really know that it does.
I think it's valuable to listen to the affected groups when you are speaking of them. What is it? Nothing about us without us. And if the group is saying this others us, or we feel left out or put off by this, you are injecting something into our culture that we don't identify with. That's a valuable thing to hear, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's also important just to sort of note, right, that there are these things that are going to be contested. Yeah. Right? And on the one hand, sure, you're using what you see as gender inclusive language. And I often use the term, I often use the term Latinx specifically, like when I'm talking in circumstances that merit it, right? But I would never in a million years go and use the term Latinx when I'm talking with my wife's family at Thanksgiving, right? They're all Latino, right? They're all from Mexico or from Texas. And they don't use the term. They don't use it at all. And it is, quite frankly, as offensive to them in this sort of linguistic imperialism to use that term in their company as it is to completely avoid or say that you will not use that terminology in circumstances where that terminology is more merited. Then I think to another point here, to Megan's earlier point about discussing what white privilege is, you can have exactly the same discussion without actually having to say the words white privilege. And I've done this myself several times, talking about the idea that, well, maybe it's better to think of white privilege not as a privilege, not as an advantage necessarily that you get by being white, but by a lack of a disadvantage that American racial hierarchy imposes on you. And people seem much more receptive to that idea. And you can have basically exactly the same conversation about whether or not you are able to get ahead easier in America by being a white person, as long as you don't use the lightning rod term that sets people off and shuts them down.
Exactly. I think it's completely about knowing when a term is appropriate, what audience is going to interpret it as positive or negative. As you say, especially with terms like Latinx, sometimes you have to use it and sometimes you really should not use it. And different groups feel very strongly about it. The same thing with privilege. They're useful terms in certain contexts. They're very not useful terms in other contexts. And Phoebe agrees.
Phoebe, I don't know if you all can hear in the background. Megan's dog is going crazy, barking at someone. We're not sure who.
Someone, something, possibly the wind, crows. I'm not sure. But do we want to take a break while I deal with them?
Sure, let's take a break. We'll come back one more time and we'll just sum up everything we've talked about and give a little bit more of an atlas for how to go forward. All right, welcome back, everyone. For those of you who are watching this in some sort of visual medium, Megan is holding on to Phoebe to stop her from barking as she was doing. But we'll be quick here. We're just going to summarize, hopefully in just a couple of minutes, everything that we've talked about over the last 40, basically, and provide a little bit of that roadmap forward. So first and foremost, main takeaway that I want people to get from the episode is you can't just rely on this issue polling. It's not sort of a be-all, end-all. It doesn't necessarily represent everyone's views that they have and are sort of concrete and stable. And it doesn't necessarily represent what's important to people or what's going to drive their vote. So you just cannot rely on it. You cannot rest on your laurels of, well, everyone agrees with me, so I don't actually need to do any of this persuasive politics stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The second thing that we want you to remember is that just like you can't count on someone agreeing with you necessarily, you can't count on that agreement being important. So what we need to do is raise the issue salience of things that people agree with progressives on. Be focusing on the information environment and talking to people in a way that makes them reprioritize, kind of rank higher the things that we all care about and agree on.
Yeah. Third, and again, I'm sorry, I know it's not a happy piece of advice, but it is our job to educate people. We cannot be sending people to Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager and the whole right-wing information ecosystem. We cannot be sending people there the second that they ask for an explanation, the second that they begin to annoy us. It doesn't help anyone. As much as it might feel good, it doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, exactly. And the last thing, when we are taking the opportunity to educate people on different issues and different policy ideas, we need to make sure that we're talking to people in a way that they can understand. If you are listening to this podcast, we love you so much. We are nerds and we are speaking about things in a very particular way. Mophie arena jokes are not going to cut it with most of the regular public.
I would honestly be surprised if most of our listener base knows who Morris Fiorina is.
Okay, fine. All right. Well, all of you have homework now.
Go read retrospective voting, Morris Fiorina, 1981. Go ahead and read it.
You're welcome. No, but seriously, to talk about things in a way that people can understand, we might be using words or terms that derail a conversation. We gave you the examples of Latinx and privilege. I'm sure there are many, many more that you could come up with. Or we may be using overly technical concepts. Clayton has tried to teach me calculus. It didn't go well. I don't think we want to be doing that with the rest of the public either.
Yeah. And so again, this is not a series of Google Maps directions. A lot of this is much harder than we make it out to be.
Yes.
Easier said than done. But as
These
you
smiles are superficial right now.
As you go through the next 4 years, as you go through the next 10 years, 20 years of politics, 40 years of politics, right? I think that this is a useful model, a useful atlas for how to conceptualize politics and how to conceptualize what your role within politics is. I don't think we have any Democratic campaign strategists listening to our little podcast here. But some people who are listening to this may be involved in local politics. They may be involved in state politics. They may be involved in advocacy organizations in some way. And if that's you, if you believe in a progressive policy future, then I think that, at least from Megan and I's perspective, we hope that we've convinced you of the validity of it, that the way forward, broadly speaking, is to reject issue polling and embrace persuasive politics. So until next time, I'm Clayton Becker.
And I'm Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.